Kia ora tātou. Me tīmata tātou. Tuatahi ka tukumihi atu ki a koutou, e piripiri ana ki tēnei hui ipurangi. He mihi kei roto i te ahu o te wiki nei, ara ko te wiki reo Māori, anō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te kaupapa o tō tātou kōrero, ko te kōrero e pāna ki te Taumata Arowai, me ngā wai e toru. Ko taku ingo ko Glenn Weber, anō reira he mihi tēnei no te tahi no kahangunu, no rongoma wahine kia tātou. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning everybody and welcome to our hui today. I've had the opportunity to meet some of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Glenn Weber, and along with Te Rau Kupenga, we've been engaged by the Department of Internal Affairs and Taumata Arowai to facilitate some engagement with you over coming weeks in relation to Three Waters Reform Program and the Taumata Arowai establishment. We're really pleased that you could make some time to join us for this hui today. We hope that you'll find it interesting. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an introductory strategic discussion on this mahi, and it's going to be followed up by a technical webinar which will be on the Water Services Bill, which is scheduled for Thursday. We would welcome your attendance at that as well. Following the webinars of this week, we're out on the road at a series of hui arohe, and we look forward to meeting some of you in person. What we are hoping to achieve today is to give you all a flavour of these important issues and to do some groundwork to prepare for the hui arohe. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we move through our program today. We only have a brief opportunity for questions and answers, and what we'd ask you to do is to use the question and answer function on this call. And if there's a question you see that you like the look of, give it the thumbs up and that'll raise the question up to the top. We probably only have the opportunity for a couple of questions after each of the three speakers that we have lined up today. The other thing to know is that this Zui is being recorded and it's going to find its way up onto the Department of Internal Affairs website. We are looking really to provide an opportunity for anyone who can't join today to get this background information. The Water Services Bill hui on Thursday is going to be more question and answer, so that one won't be recorded, but there'll be far more time for questions and for answers. The other thing we'll ask is that this is the first time we're using this technology to have a hui of this nature. We don't expect things to go perfectly, so please be patient if we're trying to figure out how to make it all work well. We'll be doing our best. But again, thank you for making the time today. That's probably enough from me. Nō reira, ka hoa tu te rākau ki a koe te minita, kai a koe te wānai nei. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Glenn, tātou katoa, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Kia hia ki ana te atākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Ti hei mauri ora ki a tātou katoa e hui mai nei, kei runga ki tēnei o ngā hui topa, kia aro atu ki ngā kaupapa e pāna ki a tātou nei wai. Nō reira, tēnei titihi e whakanui tō tātou nei reo Māori, kia tāpiri atu tātou katoa ki tērā o ngā taonga, pērā ki te wai. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in the webinar today. You're right, Glenn, it is a new way of doing things. And one thing we've learned during these uncertain times of COVID, that we've got to make more use of the technology platform and certainly the webinar conversation that we're having today. Kei konei tātou kia aro atu ki te wai, ōna momo katoa, ara ki tōna mauri, ki tōna mana. Water, as we know, is the lifeblood of many of our communities. And I think about the work that I'm leading insofar as Three Waters, and I'm mindful that for Māori as kaitiaki, it's important to ensure that there are considerations around the way in which water is protected, respected, and then utilised for the benefit of us all. Across Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's strong and enduring connections to our awa, our puna, our moana, our manga, as we rely on water for all our basic needs. our health, our environment, our economic prosperity, and also our recreation. So that's why the conversation that we're having today is so important to participate in. I want to acknowledge your role in local leadership and relationship as kaitiaki to your various waterways and water sources, and invite you to contribute to the range of conversations that we will be hosting over the next period of time. Some of you will know I grew up next to the Waikato River. It's the longest river in New Zealand, but also the most developed in terms of how it supports regional economies. The way in which we think about the river is probably threefold: in a spiritual, metaphysical element, our relationship to our healing waters, in a very practical way, because we've got the biggest power station next to my marae, so we're really mindful of electricity generation, and importantly, our sub-regional economies, because we've got a lot of agriculture in our area, and the way in which we ourselves drew kai from our river. So that relationship has a number of dimensions. But growing up along the Waikato and as tangata whenua as kaitiaki, our relationship to our river has been enduring and long-lasting. But we've seen some really worrying things over a period of time: the degradation of the river, the change in kai that we can get from our streams that feed into the river, and just the pure way in which many impacts have started to change the way we think about the sustainability and the health of our river. So it's not a quick fix. We've got to take an approach where we can all contribute to a better part of improving water quality, its use and allocation, but also its sustainability for the next generation. So during this webinar, we'll be talking a lot about three waters, but I know in the Māori worldview, water is water. It's a very holistic approach. You can't separate one element of water, the rain, from another element, which is a puna. And in fact, as we bring that thinking into the work that I'm leading, it's challenging us to consider how we might take a more integrated perspective of our role and task to protect, restore and better utilise water. It's important to outline at the front that our greatest obligation to our waterways is the way in which we provide and take account of te mana o te wai and its mauri. You'll recognise that both in the freshwater work and the work that I'm doing in Three Waters, the government has been committed to that. That's why te mana o te wai is such a fundamental concept for my consideration in my own reform program of Three Waters. And I think it's implicit in the way that we look at water as a whole system, no matter what aspect. A holistic integrated view of this precious taonga is important to Māori and how I have approached water reforms as a minister. As our government progresses a busy reform of action in the water space, it's imperative that my officials and I have regular engagement with iwi Māori. We have done so over the last 3 years, but we will continue to do so over the next period of time. It's my priority that iwi, hapu and Māori interests and perspectives are considered and woven into the entirety of these conversations as treaty partners, but also as kaitiaki who bring with us, generations of mātauranga knowledge and insight about our water. One of the things that I've learned since taking on the role of local government minister is the Havelock North incident and the surrounding context highlighted the need to improve drinking water regulation as a priority. The government understands the need to address rights and interests in freshwater, but this isn't the forum for that conversation. It's a broader conversation with other ministerial colleagues and myself, but I really want us to focus on the task at hand, which is how can we have a world-class water infrastructure system and be able to assure ourselves of safe, healthy drinking water, but also contribute to freshwater outcomes as well. I believe our Three Waters infrastructure and service delivery is something that we can't deny any longer. We can't delay it. We're faced with a Three Waters system that is under pressure across New Zealand, suffering from historic underinvestment, ageing infrastructure, and all too common failure, those burst pipes. Wherever we live across New Zealand and in our communities, everyone should have the assurance of being able to turn on the tap and get good clean water without the worry of getting sick. We all want to be able to swim in our rivers, our lakes, our beaches, and gather kaimwana without the worry of raw sewage being discharged into our pipi beds and making us sick. In many Māori communities, there's an acute feeling of despair at how the system is currently working, especially for our smaller rural communities and for our environment. And I hear this all too often: unreported spills into rivers or streams, water take consents to accommodate a change in land use, potentially impacting on freshwater outcomes in a particular rohe. Through the last 3 years, we've discussed these broad challenges. We have an ineffective regulatory regime where New Zealanders can't be sure that what comes out of the tap is safe to drink. We have a lack of consistent and clear national level oversight, direction and enforcement in the Three Waters system, which does not provide assurances that wastewater and stormwater systems are delivering outcomes that are acceptable for tangata whenua, our communities and the environment. And we have a water service delivery and funding arrangement system which have led to significant infrastructure underinvestment in many places and all too common failure. Rather than piecemeal solutions, it's clear that we need comprehensive system-wide reform to achieve lasting intergenerational benefits for our communities. Today, I'd like to give you an update on the water reform program as an overview ahead of the focus tui across the motu over the next coming week or so. These reforms have been progressed in partnership with iwi Māori councils, the water sector, and through a long conversation held over the last 3 years to address the big issues and our aspiration to deliver a world-class three water system as a lasting legacy for the next generation. This reform program has 3 main po. I'll reference these briefly before handing over to Bill Bayfield, Establishment Chief Executive of Taumata Arowai, and Alan Pragnell, Executive Director of the Three Waters Reform Program, to provide further detail. In fact, I think that might be you, Richard, perhaps. The first po, our po tuatahi around regulatory reform, the Water Services Bill. Our first po has been to comprehensively reform the drinking water regulatory framework, combined with targeted improvements to waste and stormwater regulation. The Water Services Bill, which I introduced into the House in July, contains all the details of this new regulatory regime. There will be a separate webinar on this on Thursday to discuss the key components of this bill in more detail. But taken all together, the purpose of this bill is to ensure New Zealand's drinking water is safe for our people while improving oversight and transparency of waste and stormwater networks. In keeping with our intent to approach water reform through a holistic lens, the Water Services Bill requires all persons who have functions or duties under this legislation to give effect to te mana o te wai. Importantly, this will require councils to engage with tangata whenua in areas such as source water protection or water management decisions. This bill is the result of significant engagement between central government, iwi partners and local government. Thank you once again for your knowledgeable and valuable contribution to this. And I encourage you to take the opportunity to have your say on the bill's contents when it progresses through the select committee stage. I just note that there will be a long exposure, longer than usual, in terms of people having access to this bill, so you'll get a good period of time to consider it. Our po tuarua, the second pillar of our water reform agenda, has been to create a new dedicated water services regulator called Taumata Arowai to monitor and enforce the entire drinking water system. Taumata Arowai will also play a role in improving environmental outcomes for freshwater and shine a light on the performance of our three water system. In carrying out its remit, Taumata Arowai will be guided by a Māori advisory group. This will also help to guide the organisation on Māori interests and knowledge and how to give effect to te mana o te wai, mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori as it is to be exercised. Bill Bayfield, the Establishment Chief Executive of Taumata Arowai, is here and will shortly outline in more detail the organisation's role. Pou tuatoru, the third pou of our Three Waters mahi, is reforming arrangements for the delivery of water services to communities. Alan Pregnell's been working on this and the DIA team, and there'll be further talk about the looming costs on councils and what they will face over the coming years, and how the reform program is looking to ensure first world water services with greater environmental impacts so that they're not unaffordable for our communities across New Zealand. It's pretty stark to outline that fundamental change is required to deliver long-term, enduring solutions. As a starting point, the government would like to see the creation of a small number of multi-regional entities that are structured as statutory entities, guided by professionals and led by competency-based boards with mechanisms to allow for iwi Māori input. That they're publicly owned with a preference for collective council ownership. That they're of sufficient size to take advantage of cross-boundary economies of scale and catchments of interest, and are asset owning with balance sheet separation and improved access to capital. These water service delivery entities would ultimately deliver more affordable, efficient, reliable and resilient water services, while significantly improving the safety and quality of drinking water and the performance of wastewater systems. While the entities would service larger areas and have efficiencies in doing so, this is not about watering down iwi Māori connection to the service providers. We need to find our way through this very complex conversation. We need to work together as we design the future of the water service providers to ensure appropriate mechanisms are put in place to retain and amplify your voice in these services. There are many local examples of where things have worked well, and I can tell you, councils have reflected back to me that they would like to take those arrangements forward in any type of reform in this area. Affirming the government's commitment towards this transformational reform program, we've committed to a stimulus package, wave one, of 761 million. Local authorities, as owners of a large portion of Three Waters infrastructure, have been allocated part of this funding to help councils deliver urgent Three Water infrastructure upgrades and stimulate local economies in response to COVID-19. I note that some of you attended the recent workshops the Joint Steering Committee held on how councils could receive this funding and participate in the reform program. As local partners with local government, it's important you remain linked into these conversations between central and local government, while also noting that you have a unique treaty relationship with the Crown. I'd like you to consider how iwi interests might be able to engage with my work program as I'm outlining today. We've always made it clear that we want to approach service delivery reform in partnership with local government and you as our treaty partners. It's important that the rights of iwi Māori and our special connections with water are upheld through these reforms. That's why we're very much committed to meaningful engagement with iwi Māori representatives, including a series of hui and workshops across the country that start next week. You will have heard me refer to the working group, the joint working group, which is made up of local government in New Zealand and DIA officials. I think if we were proceeding down a pathway where we could encourage iwi to form almost a joint working group, and if that is the culmination of thoughts over these next few weeks, I would be pleased to entertain that whakaaro. But the most important point is that we try and have a way to engage proactively with the reform program. These regulatory reforms represent a significant but necessary lifting of standards and requirements to make our drinking water safer. Iwi and hapu often have marae, papakainga and surrounding community water supplies. As small water providers, Taumata Arowai will be working closely with you to help understand and meet these requirements. There's a period of time with which you need to be compliant, but the important thing is that you're working with Taumata Arowai. This will continue to require local kaimahi, Maintaining and growing your unique perspective, skill sets and experience will be critical to making this regime work as intended. Things like local skills development and training and the advancement of mātauranga Māori and best practice will be important on the ground and within our communities. Of the funding, the government has committed to a stimulus in Three Waters infrastructure and to support the reform program. 30 million will help smaller non-council water suppliers meet costs in the face of the new regulatory regime. We're still considering how best to operationalise this funding for small suppliers such as Marae and expect to be able to discuss this with you shortly. In pulling together all aspects of our Three Waters mahi, strengthened regulation, dedicated national level oversight and service delivery reform, we want New Zealand to have an integrated and holistic water management system from the source to the tap, down through the pipes and back out to the environment again. We want an effective regulatory regime where drinking water suppliers must own the safety of their water and where the health and well-being of the people in our communities comes first, absolutely. We want to see a system that is careful with the disposal of waste and stormwater, that leads to positive outcomes for water quality and biodiversity, and that is responsive to cultural aspects and te mana o te wai. We want to see strong, financially capable water providers able to take a catchment-wide approach and consider our community needs in a sustainable way. We want these entities to be innovative and make use of mātauranga Māori, water-sensitive engineering solutions and sustainable urban design. We want to see a service delivery system that leads to better outcomes for our communities, not just in terms of safety, but in terms of equitable access to more affordable and reliable services. We importantly want to see a system that respects, enhances, and listens to you as kaitiaki of this taonga. In fact, listens to our community, our citizens, and what they want to see. There's a lot of similarities. This will require co-design with you as to how we can achieve that vision. To achieve this vision, we need to work together. Central and local government, iwi, Māori partners, the water industry, our communities and others. And we must bring our communities, all of us, forward together. This is our chance to achieve a lasting transformation and legacy contribution to our tamariki and mokopuna. Let's together build a world-class Three Waters system that delivers lasting benefits we wish to see for Aotearoa New Zealand. I appreciate such a co-design process and ongoing conversations over the coming years are resource intensive, and for that I thank you all for your time, considered input and leadership. I look forward to continuing this journey with you over the coming years as we progress this reform in partnership. Nō reira hei whakakapi a tātou nei kōrero, mā te mahi tahi, ka oti, ka ora tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Te minita, tēnā koe. Thank you for taking us through that overview. There's a lot of material in there. We know how busy your days are. Do you have some time available if I invite some questions to come in? Ka pai. Okay, whānau, we have the opportunity to cover any pressing questions. Please jump on the Q&A function, send them through, and then we'll put a couple of questions to the Minister while we have the opportunity to have her with us. Te pātai. Okay. Given that we haven't received any here we go. Anei te pātai tuatai. Ben Dixon. Will a change of government affect the reform? Minister kei a koe.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. Let me put it this way. When I came into Parliament some years ago, one of the issues that was raised was the state of the Three Waters infrastructure system. So it's been sitting around probably for a good 10 to 15 years, this particular issue. So I've made this one of my key priorities because I know that a strong world-class water infrastructure system underpins things like housing, regional growth and development, the state of our marae, and the like. So I've definitely ensured alongside the DIA team that this was one of my key priorities as Minister for Local Government. I can't guarantee that if there was a change of government that the reform would progress in the way that I'm proposing. Some of the points of difference that I've maintained all the way through this approach is that any reform of our water services delivery must lead to a public model, not a privatised model. And we must work in a way that assures local government and iwi that the existing arrangements can be carried through into the new service delivery arrangements, but also, importantly, that we're building Te Mana o Te Wai into the role of the regulator, because the freshwater outcomes and the role of the regulator in relationship to achieving those outcomes are quite linked. So I can't guarantee that if there's a change of government, the reforms will proceed in the way that I'm proposing. I think the next question is, program seems a bit light on regarding stormwater. That's from Toki Taiao. Thanks for that question, Toki. The role of Taumata Arowai, and Bill will speak in more detail to that, at this stage has a strong emphasis on drinking water quality and an oversight role of waste and stormwater. Over time, there may be a strengthening of that role, but what we want the absolute focus to be at the outset is on drinking water. The regulatory framework for waste and stormwater will still remain with regional councils and under the RMA. The next question is from, will the Minister's notes be available after the Sui meeting? Thank you, Te Arani. Yes, that'll come through DIA. From anonymous attendee, is the commitment to Te Mana o Te Wai given force in legislation? Insofar as Taumata Arowai, yes it is. And I think that has been a helpful intervention and contribution by iwi kahui wai Māori who have advised and participated in our engagement process.
Kia ora. Thank you for the questions, Minister. Thank you for those answers. And just to confirm that this is being recorded, and the recording of this is available to you after the hui and will be up on the Three Waters website. Let's continue on through our program then. Minister, thanks again for your contribution today. I'll invite Bill Bayfield, who is the Establishment CEO, to talk to us about Taumata Arowai. Kia koe, Bill.
Thank you, Glenn. Tēnā koutou katoa. Taumata Arowai will become Aotearoa's dedicated regulator of three waters, that is drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. We expect that to happen sometime in the second half of next year. The exact date will be determined when the Water Services Bill that gives us our duties and functions and powers is passed. Taumata Arowai will then take over the drinking water regulator role that currently sits with the Ministry of Health, with the district health boards and with the associated public health units. So Taumata Arowai exists, we're just not up and running as a regulator yet. Until that time, drinking water suppliers and operators are required to continue to comply with Ministry of Health requirements. So it is business as usual until then. But from that time when we stand up, our role will come down to essentially two things. Firstly, we will oversee and administer an expanded and strengthened drinking water regulatory system to ensure all New Zealand communities have access to safe drinking water. And that includes holding suppliers and operators to account if need be. And then secondly, with regional councils remaining the primary regulators of wastewater and stormwater, Taumata Arowai will oversee from a national perspective the regulation, management and environmental performance of wastewater and stormwater networks. That role will include promoting public understanding of the performance of those systems. That is shining a light on how those systems are performing, as the Minister puts it. That's really important to us. As many iwi Māori will be aware, Aotearoa's critical public water services are facing urgent challenges. Havelock North inquiry showed us we had many significant deficiencies in the provision and the regulation of drinking water. and the subsequent Three Waters review found many deficiencies in the performance and environmental impacts of our wastewater and stormwater systems. We also know that Māori are disproportionately represented in those communities where access to safe, sustainable and resilient water services is an issue. The water reforms the Minister has spoken about, of which the establishment of Taumata Arowai is part, is intended to provide more equitable access to affordable water services, including safe drinking water. Taumata Arowai is also charged with giving greater recognition to Māori as our treaty partner through providing partnership opportunities that recognise their ability and their knowledge to contribute to the improvements needed in our three water systems. For Taumata Arowai, this is about partnership and ensuring that our mahi identifies and reflects tangata whenua values and interests, as well as sometimes obligations in the governance and management of the three waters within your rohi and takiwa. The Minister gave Taumata Arowai its name, and it's one that she speaks of with passion. And all of us in the Taumata Arowai establishment team are working to give effect to that name, following that passion, by firstly building towards a whole system perspective of water, a perspective, of course, that Māori have always had, and lifting our sights and aspiring to the highest outcomes for three waters in Aotearoa. My aim as the establishment CEO and all of my team is that Taumata Arowai will be the effective real-world regulator for three waters in Aotearoa. This means working collaboratively build, firstly, a self-directing, strong sector by supporting and encouraging suppliers and operators to do the right thing in the right way at the right time, focusing immediately on providing safe drinking water. We will also have a transparent regulatory strategy that everyone will be able to see, so that drinking water suppliers and others, including iwi Māori, know what is expected of suppliers and operators and of us. In addition, we want to empower communities by providing information on the safety and the environmental impacts of their drinking water, as well as the wastewater and stormwater system or networks within their rohi and takiwa. And this approach recognises that we all have a duty of care to ensure that all New Zealanders can access safe drinking water and safe waters. We will take a proportionate and therefore risk-based approach to compliance, monitoring and enforcement. These activities will be fit for purpose, according to the scale and the complexity and the risk profile, rather than one size fits all. This will be a key approach in understanding whānau, hapu iwi and ropu Māori interests. Our approach for small suppliers like marae and papakaianga will inevitably not be the same as those for large complex supplies in our cities and our towns. Oh, you were right about technology, Glenn. As a real-world regulator, our mahi will be informed by two key considerations. We need to be clear on who's responsible for what. We will monitor and assess compliance, but we won't act as the approver of things that supplier or operator is expected to meet as they do their duty to all those they supply drinking water to. For example, drinking water safety plans. And really importantly, and this has been stressed by the Minister, and forgive me, but throughout my experience of this job so far, very strongly stressed, we will hold suppliers and operators to account. While we want to work collaboratively with drinking water suppliers and wastewater operators, we will hold them to account if they are not providing New Zealanders safe water. In keeping with the government's other water reforms, the establishment of Taumata Arowai acknowledges that more needs to be done by the Crown to reflect and protect Māori rights, interests and obligations. Our legislation has been informed by the policy developed over the course of the last year, and the policy decisions reflect a targeted engagement with iwi Māori led by Minister Mahuta. This included convening the iwi representative ropu made up of post-settlement iwi, and a targeted engagement strategy that was designed to reflect the demands on iwi, hapu and whānau time. As you are no doubt aware if you're attending this Zui, we're about to embark on a round of hui with iwi Māori, so that we will continue to be informed and supported by relationships with iwi Māori as we prepare to stand up Taumata Arowai. At the hui, we'll talk about input into the appointments process for Taumata Arowai's independent board and Māori advisory group. We'll also talk about the Water Services Bill, encouraging all those who are interested to make submissions on this bill that sets out the regulatory framework that Taumata Arowai will administer. The bill is so new, as the ministers noted, that it hasn't even been referred to as select committee yet. It's currently awaiting its first reading post-election, and we're hoping that it'll be referred to as select committee before Christmas. At that point, there will be an opportunity for all to make submissions. There's a separate webinar on Thursday for those wanting to understand the bill in more detail. I hope some of you can attend that. Alongside our independent board, we'll have a Māori advisory group to advise on Māori interests and knowledge as they relate to our objectives, our functions, and our operating principles. The group will work closely with Taumata Arowai's board members, who will all be required to have a broad knowledge of tiriti, Māori perspectives, and tikanga Māori. There is a requirement for the board to demonstrate that it has given regard to the advisory group's advice, so it can't just pay lip service to the group's views. The intent is absolutely to ensure that Māori interests and knowledge are embedded appropriately through Taumata Arowai, and that we have the capability to uphold the principles of the tiriti o Waitangi and to engage with iwi Māori. The group will also help inform us and help us to learn how Taumata Arowai can give effect to Te Mana me Te Māori o Te Wai. Taumata Arowai will be very proud to be the first government agency to embed Te Mana o Te Wai in how we carry out our functions. Māori have always taken a whole system approach to water, looking at the picture from Maonga to Moana, ki utu ki tai. The whole system approach to water recognises Te ao Māori worldviews consist of fundamentals of tikanga, mataranga Māori and kaitiakitanga, to name but a few. There are whole knowledge systems embedded in how and why iwi Māori do things to protect and care for water in their rohi and takiwa. We are engaging with iwi Māori through these hui and will continue to do so, to work through how we give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. COVID and the postponed election means that the appointments to our board and the advisory group are still some way off, but we're working through that process and we'll progress it with urgency with the minister post-election. In summary, the next slide should show the timelines for standing up Taumata Arowai. It's great to be involved in setting up a brand new 3-water regulator for Aotearoa, and we expect that will occur in the second half of 2021. Until that time, we will continue to support the Ministry of Health as the regulator of drinking water through these challenging COVID times. So I hope that what I've offered today is a snapshot of where Taumata Arowai is at in the very beginnings of its standing up, that those points have resonated with you. And if you'd like to know more, I'd encourage you to do 5 things. Firstly, come to one of the hui. And if you plan to come, take a look at the next slide that sets out some questions about Te Mana o Te Wai, and come to the hui prepared to discuss what it means to you. You might also want to dial into Thursday's webinar to find out more about the Water Services Bill in its very early stage. And if you wanted to get an email on when the Water Services Bill will be referred to the Select Committee and submissions are called for, then go to the parliamentary website and sign up to receive electronic updates. We will do our best to keep you informed. And consider, of course, making a submission. It is vital that New Zealand gets this piece of legislation right. I look forward to possibly seeing you at a hui. If not, mā te wā.
Kia ora, Bill. Thank you very much for taking us through that. In the course of your presentation, a few questions have come in. We've got a few minutes. Why don't we have a look at those? First question: how will Te Taumata Arowai give effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi? Bill, is that one you like?
The Entity Act requires us to. And I think that the whole structure that the Minister has brought to bear will assist us, perhaps better than any other Crown entity established so far. If you look at the setup of that independent board and the relationship with the Māori advisory group, then I think at the top of our structure, our governing structure, we are well set up to give effect to Treaty of Waitangi and to Māori aspirations. Throughout the organisation as we establish it, we're working very closely with iwi Māori and have already got a group of iwi Māori advisors assisting us, including members of Ka Hui Wai Māori. And they're assisting us with understanding what Te Mana Te Wai might mean for us so that we can go to the new board and to the Māori advisory group when they're stood up, hopefully in March 2021, and we're well on the way. But I guess the ultimate test of whether we're doing it well will be on how iwi Māori perceive us, probably after the first year of operation.
Thank you, Bill. Minister, of course, you have a green light if there's anything in here you want to jump in and comment on. If there's nothing.
I would say to that question that Section 5, yeah. Section 5 of the Taumata Arowai Act and 14 to 17 of the Taumata Arowai Act clearly sets out the way in which Māori interests are not only taken account of but provided for within the context of the regulator. If we were to take a purist view around that particular question, how will Taumata Arowai give effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi? It's in the application of those aspects of the Act that the treaty can be taken account of.
Kia ora, Minister. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Moving on to the next question. Hapu are closer to Waimaori than iwi. What's your plan to meaningfully engage with hapu and kāinga Māori? Bill, I'll invite you first.
That, as we all know, is a hell of a challenge. And I guess in scheduling the hui that we're doing and coming out to engage with iwi Māori at places of their choice, to have a discussion on how we give effect to Te Mana Te Wai and to our powers and functions, demonstrates a commitment to do that. I trust that any members of specific hapu can attend those hui and voice their feelings there. And then in terms of the performance of individual wastewater, water supply or stormwater systems, then we will have systems whereby hapu can see the performance, that shining of a light on the performance that the Minister spoke of, and therefore we look forward to engaging with those hapu through our regional networks. We've yet to decide exactly where our regional centres are going to be, but we anticipate between 30 to 40% of our staff will be out in the regions actively working.
Minister.
I would say, to complement Bill's response, that we've got to look at the regulator alongside the councils and the functions that they must continue to undertake on a day-to-day basis. So many councils have a relationship with hapu who undertake kaitiaki functions. What Taumata Arowai will do in relation to Te Mana o Te Wai and the provision of those particular aspects or considerations is probably further open the door for councils to give effect to how to better engage kaitiaki in being able to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai expectations. But you know, what we're asking through this webinar is that we can engage with hapu, with iwi Māori on the strategic conversation so that we can get a better connection between the regulatory function of Taumata Arowai, but also the service delivery responsibility that currently sits with the 67 councils and over time with other entities. We need to get that strategic connect positioned well in order for this to work.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Bill. Look, we probably have time for one more before we move to the rest of the program. But before we answer that, I'll just a note, any questions that aren't answered specifically in the webinar today, we will come prepared to answer, or the team will come prepared to answer as we go out to Hui Arohi. So as I said at the start, we don't have the opportunity to run through everything, but we will make sure every question does get an answer. So we'll take the one that's got the couple of thumbs up, which is at the top of the list, is the Māori Advisory Group co-governance with the board of Taumata Arowai or advisory. Again, how will Taumata Arowai give effect to the articles of the treaty? So any comments from any of the panel on the first part of that question in particular?
Yeah, I'd guide you to the Act, the Taumata Arowai Act, clause 17.3 ABC. It gives you a really clear expectation that the board must have regard to the advice coming from the Māori Advisory Group. Further in that section, it's outlined how the board should do it through its reporting function and the like. So this is, once the advice goes to the board, it must be taken again, have regard to in the way that they're considering their role and function.
Ka Minister, thank you. Bill, anything you wish to add to that?
I find it exciting that then if the board does not take the Māori Advisory Group's advice, it is written into the legislation that the board must state the reasons why when they report to the minister.
Kia ora. Thank you, Bill. Okay, we'll leave the rest of these questions now. We'll move through to our next presenter. If we've got some time at the end, we'll pick up some of these. Otherwise, as I said, we'll find a way for those answers to get to given at the hui arohe. So next we have Richard Ward, and Richard is an example of that technology issue I was talking about before. Alan Pregner was lined up, but unfortunately hasn't been able to jump online where he's currently located, so we're pleased to have Richard. Richard, over to you.
Tēnā koe Glenn, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Richard Ward taku inoa. As Glenn said, I'm sort of standing in for Alan Pregnell, who's my partnership director and colleague who's leading out on the Three Waters sort of reform. And my job really over the next 10 minutes is just to give you a bit of an oversight of what the Minister referred to as the third PO, the reform program for how we're thinking about the actual delivery of water services. So not the regulatory side, but actually the thinking about how water services are delivered now, which is predominantly through your local councils. And what we'll also do is introduce you to some of the questions that we'll be wanting to discuss with you at the hui that we are starting next week. We have done the typical Wellington thing, in that to make this thing manageable, we have sort of divided it up into sort of different areas and different things, but recognising, of course, that all of this sits within that much wider conversation around water. And if we go back probably 3 years now, we started the conversations around Three Waters with iwi Māori across the country, and with councils and with the Three Water sector as a whole, and initiated largely because of the Havelock North outbreak. Where those discussions sort of went was a focus very much onto the regulatory side, and that has obviously resulted in the Water Services Bill and the Taumata Arowai legislation, the first and the second PO that the Minister referred to. So now while they are well underway, we are now turning our attention back into the service delivery and how we set a service delivery system up for the long term to be able to meet the challenges that we have in the future. We know that one of the major challenges that we have is just the level of investment that is required from local government to enable fresh drinking water for all and for good quality treatment of our wastewater all the way through. And we know that those challenges are incredibly large. We also know that COVID-19 and the economic impacts will make those challenges even harder. And this is something that we have heard from our number of hui that we've held in our engagements with iwi Māori over the last 3 years, is exactly the frustrations really with a lot of the councils that they have been dealing with in terms of being able to get some of their smaller supplies or where their communities, your communities are living and being able to get that level of investment that you need. We know that councils have looming costs in front of them. We know that they're talking around about $570 odd million required to upgrade all drinking water plants to meet drinking water standards. And what we also know is that there's around about a $3 to $4 billion cost for wastewater plants to meet the environmental standards. What we don't necessarily know is when we start to think about stormwater, about exactly what those costs are going to be. But we do know that they are going to be many orders of magnitude larger than the costs that we do know about. We also know that we have a large number of wastewater treatment plants that will need to be reconsented in the next 10 years, and that the consent conditions are going to be higher as the standards increase. So the standards they had to meet when they were consented 20 years ago are not the same standards they're going to meet now. So those costs are going to increase even greater. One of the key issues sitting in this large investment program, and we sort of think of it as numbers have been put on it, and they sort of sit around about probably about the $30 billion mark, sitting out there over the next sort of period, is that depending upon where you are as to whether that is affordable and whether it can be funded under the current system. So that if you're sitting in Auckland or you're sitting in a very large metro centre, then simply because of the numbers of people that you have, and often the technology and the expertise and the capability that sits within those councils, then your share of the costs are likely to be more affordable. However, once you get out into the provincial, and then once you get out into the rural communities, then we know that those costs very, very quickly become unaffordable. And so one of the sort of key fundamental drivers for us is how do we set up a new Three Waters delivery system that is financially sustainable and affordable over the long term. And it's not just about scale, but it's also about regulation, and it's also about governance, and it's about all parts of the system working together. So what I'll do is give you a very quick overview of the reform program and whereabouts we're actually sort of going with it. We have stage 1 that we're in at the moment, which is an opt-in reform program for councils. And so this is where we've sort of partnered with the local government sector to work through what the details are and what a longer term system could actually look like. And as part of that, the government has committed a $761 million package to help stimulate investment and create jobs to assist with economic recovery. And alongside that is the work that we'll be doing with the councils on, thinking about larger scale providers, to think about how we can realise some of the economic and the sort of the public health benefits and the environmental benefits that we need from this reform program. What we'll also then be moving into is to a phase sort of 2. So this is where the councils have now signed up to all an MOU to sort of share information and to participate in this work program. And that came about from some of the hui that we held with local authorities and councils over sort of that July and that first week of August sort of period. And I know that a number of you may well have attended those. So the good news is that all the councils are on board with the reform program in terms of signing the MOU and receiving the funding, and are now working with Crown Infrastructure Partners, CIP, on how they will be spent. And what is also really heartening is from a lot of conversations with the councils is how they are thinking about using some of that funding in terms of the smaller sort of rural community sort of drinking water supplies. So we now have a period of over the next year really where we start to work through the detail, and we have that good faith agreement to be working through. And in a way it is a bit of a tripartite. So we sort of have the Crown and the iwi Māori partnership, and then we have the local government iwi sort of partnership and relationship. And so it's all three sort of working together to work through what this longer term reform looks like. And then over the top of that one, then there will be a sort of another, probably about a 3-year horizon, a 3-year period where we will be looking to transition and to implement where we get to with the reform. So the obvious question is, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve, from the reform? We've had a lot of work done on the regulation, and we've seen the results of that coming through. So as we kick off on this next stage of the water services delivery, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? What are our objectives that are out there? And number one, across the top, is that we have to, as we go through here, is to work out better mechanisms for enabling iwi Māori rights and interest to be coming through in terms of water and in terms of how that water services are delivered. We have a second sort of objective in there around significantly improving the safety and the quality of our drinking water services and the environmental performance of wastewater and stormwater systems. And that is one of the really large frustrations that we have heard loud and clear as we've gone around the country and engaged with you over the last sort of 3 years. We have a really big question around why should only some New Zealanders have access to affordable 3 water services? So how do we look to ensure that all New Zealanders have equitable access to affordable 3 water services? We also have another objective around improving the resource coordination and unlocking the strategic opportunities. Now, a lot of that is, for instance, if you live in growth areas or areas where the housing costs are very, very high, or there is a need to look at opportunities for pakāinga, etc. All of that requires infrastructure, and a number of our sort of councils are really struggling to be able to unlock some of those strategic opportunities simply because of the cost of putting in the basic 3 water infrastructure that's required. And that is a national issue, and it is impacting on our overall economics and sort of social well-being as a country. We also know that as we look ahead, that resilience is a much greater issue. So we're talking about climate change, we're talking about more sort of flooding and inundation events, we're talking more about sea level rise, and we know that we have a lot of wastewater treatment plants, for instance, located on the coast. We have a lot of low-lying areas that are at risk of flooding. So how do we future-proof and increase the resilience of our 3 waters infrastructure in that long term? And as I've already said, one of our key objectives is around the 3 waters being on a more financially sustainable footing over the long term. How do we address the affordability, the capability challenges, and especially those faced by the smaller councils and the smaller suppliers? And all the way through this, and this is where regulation and sort of performance sort of benchmarking can have a real sort of major impact, is how do we actually make all of this area more visible, more transparent and more accountable, so it's actually easier to see what we are spending and how well our systems are performing, because a lot of that stuff at the moment is very much just a black box that is very hard to sort of see and to work out. So they are sort of the key objectives, and as I said, one of the key ones that sort of runs right the way through this is, as we get into the detail, as we sort of think about how we reform water services delivery, what are our mechanisms for enabling the iwi Māori rights and interests as we go through. One of as the Minister sort of introduced and talked about, is one of the government's sort of goals through this, and the starting positions is looking to create larger water entities that have that scale and can sort of provide that financial sustainability. And so when we sort of think about larger entities, there's 3 sort of areas that we are thinking. So number one is just a scale, so making them larger, having more consumers and sort of users of the water helps to achieve sort of greater affordability in there. When we think about, we also need to think about communities of interest. So what are some of the alignments, for instance, of things like geographical boundaries, that would sort of go into making up new, larger sort of water entities? What are some of the takiwā or the rohi that you would sort of need to consider and to sort of think about? We're thinking here around sort of catchments. We think about we also need to think about relevant regulatory sort of boundaries. So how do we sort of manage all of this in a holistic sort of manner? So we know from all the international models and the work that sort of has been done, as well as some of our own New Zealand experience and looking at things like Wellington Water and sort of water care and the work that we have done, is just that we have a good perspective on some of the benefits of scale, but we need to do more work to actually understand what this looks like in a uniquely New Zealand context. When we sort of look at some of the features of what if we design and reform the water services, sort of industry, what are some of the features that we're sort of thinking about here? So we've talked quite a bit about the scale, and most likely that it is multi-regional. So it's larger than just one region. because we are looking here at the very long term. So we are not just looking at what happens in 3 years' time or 5 years' time, but we're looking to try and set up a system for 10 years and for 30 years into the future, 50 years. We are talking about entities or water sort of entities that own their own assets, because what that enables them to do is to be able to fund and finance the capital that they need to make the investments and to be able to operate the water services. Really important point here, just as Bill talked about with Taumata Arowai and Te Mana o Te Wai having been built into the legislation, what we have here is an opportunity to create a new statutory entity. So we can create really a bespoke entity that's going to work for the New Zealand context. We're definitely talking about, as I've mentioned, one of the key objectives and the features that we need is to making sure we've got those right mechanisms in place for enabling the iwi, the Māori and the community to be able to provide input in relation to those new entities. So that these are not just very large sort of monoliths that sit out there and never are actually able to engage with the smaller sort of communities. That there is that opportunity for those, that community, that input to be there and to be heard. The Minister has very clearly outlined that they are public-owned entities, and we have a preference for collective council ownership. So this is not a privatisation sort of agenda. It is not on the table at all. And one of the reasons for sort of talking around collective council ownership is that provides another sort of protection in terms of making sure that these stay publicly owned entities. And the last one that I'll sort of just touch on today is, and this will be an interesting sort of conversation that we can have potentially in the hui, is the delivery of drinking water and wastewater services is definitely the sort of a top priority. But there's a real question around, would you include stormwater in these new water entities? And so there's lots of arguments sort of for and lots of arguments sort of against. And so that is something that we will still need to work through, but very much for the first period anyway, a big focus around a priority around drinking water and around wastewater. So what that does is give you just a bit of an idea about sort of, I guess, a little bit about where we've sort of come from. It gives you a bit of an idea about what are some of the objectives that we're looking for from the water services, sort of the delivery services reform. And it gives you an idea about some of the features that we're thinking about that the new system and the new entities sort of needs to look at. And now if we look a little bit at the timetable that's sort of ahead of us, and we've mentioned back in 2016 the Havelock North sort of outbreak. And so the fact that these conversation and this work has now been around for around about 4 years. And so we have a 3-year sort of program, as we sort of mentioned, outlined in front of us. So we've had the MOUs, we've had the stimulus funding sort of announcement, and that is now going to be worked through with delivery plans. We're going to spend what is year 1 on that slide, sort of working with and engaging with councils, with yourselves, with other water sort of stakeholders, our partners, and working through a lot of the detail of what that will look like. And then that is likely to lead, hopefully, to legislation into the 2nd year. And that legislation is likely to take around about a year, maybe a little bit shorter. And then in year 3 is when you start to get a little bit into the implementation and the transition sort of side of it. And really this graph does need to be many years long because, as I said, the focus is on a long-term system that we're trying to build here. Something that'll work not only necessarily just on day 1, but actually on year 5, year 10, year 30, year 50. And it's going to take us a while to be able to transition through into that. So that sort of gives you a bit of an idea about sort of what the background to the reform, the water services delivery reform is, about how it originally started as sort of one conversation and then sort of separated into the regulatory and then now back into the service delivery. And then we're bringing the two together when we come back out to talk to you for the hui starting sort of next week. So some of the sort of key questions that we'll sort of be thinking, asking you to think about ahead of the hui and that we'll be working through at the hui. Things like, let's get into some of the more detail around what some of those main issues and those problems are sort of with water services. How can hapu iwi Māori benefit from this process? And I go back to the question that was sort of asked before around the engagement with hapu. They will be a critical input into these reforms. And then there's a real interesting conversation to be had with you just around, so what are the characteristics that you would like to see to be built into these new water services entities? And the final thing I would probably say is that look, this is not just a 3-week sort of program. There is a long-term sort of engagement and program that will be happening over this time. So this is just the next stage in that conversation. And as you will see from the hui, once we get into these discussions, there is a lot more detail that we need to work through, and we'll need to continue to keep engaging with you, over the next year and beyond as we work these through. But other than that, I would just like to encourage you to spread the word, talk to your networks, and hopefully we'll see you at one of the hui starting next week with Palmerston North and Kaitaia. Over to you, Glenn.
Richard, thank you for taking us through that part of the presentation. In the course of your presentation, some questions have come up. Let's turn to some of those now. What I propose you do is step past the Taumata Arowai questions and jump down to the question for Edith. The first one there, how will you ensure that organisations in local government engage mana whenua to have meaningful kōrero to inform decisions, relocations, projects and information? Richard, is that one you'd like to provide a view on?
I'm just looking at that question now. Thanks, Glenn. Sorry, it just sort of keeps jumping around. It must have lots of likes and rising to the top, maybe. Yes. Yeah. I'm very, very encouraged, actually, to be honest, from our conversations with local government as we sort of went around. And in part because one of the issues, especially with, I think, a lot of the smaller supplies and the marae and the iwi Māori communities, is they are often smaller and they are often sort of geographically on the sort of the outer edges of often a lot of the districts. And the number of ratepayers that are sitting in there make investment in that very, very difficult. And it always seems to be difficult for councils to try and sort of cross-subsidise and to be able to fund some of those smaller schemes. So councils were very excited about the idea about being able to have this funding that the government has given them in terms of investment stimulus, and that they didn't need to sort of raise that money then from the ratepayers. And so that was very much, I think, for most councils that we talked to around the rohi when we were out doing our workshops, that was very much sort of top of mind for most of them. So we have encouraged them to continue to sort of do that engagement. And we have, through the Joint Steering Committee, we have regular communications out through sort of councils. So we will certainly be encouraging them to continue to be thinking and doing their delivery plans and engaging to work out what of those projects would be most suitable.
Thank you, Richard. E te minita, e kōrero mahau, pāna ki tēnā whātai?
No, really to support what Richard has said, councils have been very open in the way that they wanting to engage locally with their iwi and hapu around the waters issue. Where to start might be the challenge for some of them, but it's not a space where there's active ignoring of the need to have this conversation, and I think that provides real opportunity and should provide encouragement to those who are really wanting to get into this space.
Kia ora.
Glenn, if I could offer a comment?
Of course, Bill.
I think that part of the shining of the light on the performance of wastewater and stormwater networks in particular, and the publishing of that information will firstly prove very difficult and uncomfortable for regional councils and indeed those treatment suppliers and operators. And as Taumata Arowai, I look forward to doing that. And I guess my experience as a CEO of regional councils, both in the Bay of Plenty and Canterbury, would tell me that I will find that, or I would have found that very uncomfortable to ensure that then that regional council reaches out to mana whenua to have the discussions that Edith has highlighted. And I guess the other point I'd make is that we are introducing Te Mana o Te Wai into those conversations and into those performance questions. And I think that again will drive regional councils, as they're indicating they're willing to do, to very much engage with mana whenua, as indeed we would expect the suppliers of water, wastewater treatment and stormwater treatment and operators to do so too.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Richard. Let's jump to the question by George Asher. In the past few months, councils have submitted their proposals for reform programs for the MOU. Why has hapu engagement with councils not been encouraged prior to or during this phase?
Let me jump in and have a crack at that one, because thanks for the question, George. We've engaged with councils in this way in the first instance, and that they are they're the asset owners, and the stimulus package was designed to try and bring forward what they'd already forecast in the annual plans around repairs and maintenance work that they had foreshadowed, and it would directly support the local recovery efforts in terms of giving certainty to their contracting community for that work. It's not that we weren't engaging with hapu and iwi. We want to make sure we're engaging at the right level on the right issues in a way that we can support the engagement and how everything's connecting together. So, you know, obviously as asset owners, and you'd appreciate this, there is a primary interest and role that you would want to have. Every council in taking up the opportunity to participate in this reform program has in one way or another reflected where they have local relationships with iwi. They are asking us to try and work this out. So these next lot of consultations that we're having with iwi who are hapu, whoever want to be involved in this reform program, this is why we're having the conversation, because councils need a steer on how they should be thinking about it. Some won't wait. Some, like just as recently as this morning, in Taranaki, they're going to engage with the iwi that they have around their table, so that they're initiating the conversation and readiness for the engagement that we're embarking on. But the point is, this isn't about ignoring the interests of hapu. It's the right conversation at the right time with the right level of impetus as to what the interest is in this particular area.
Kia ora, te minita. Let's jump down to the question from an anonymous attendee. How will you ensure against privatisation of these water entities?
Yeah, that's one of the things I raised in my opening remarks. And at the outset with the councils, I've been really clear. The point of difference about my leadership on this particular issue going forward, as I've maintained right from the get-go, is that the model that I'm looking to build in partnership with the sector, in conjunction with the interests of iwi Māori, is a public model. And there's no appetite that I sense, no strong appetite to go down a privatised route. In fact, we're going to have to work very strongly on how legislating for that can be guaranteed to give greatest assurance to the public and to all the sector interests.
Kia ora. Let's stay at this end of the questions. Will there be Māori procurement targets as part of this funding package?
Glenn, I can sort of pick that one up. The answer is the short answer is no, there has been nothing specified in the criteria. And part of the reason for that is that we've tried to keep the funding package has been tried to be as flexible as possible with as few conditions on it. So we're very aware that there are some parts of the country that have got real capacity and capability constraints. We're also very aware that there are some parts of the country that have had a lot of other sort of, development and stimulus funding that has sort of gone into it. And so the idea of the stimulus funding is that there are as few conditions sort of as possible, and that it is left as open as possible for councils to be working with their communities on how best to sort of deliver and prioritise sort of water and wastewater sort of improvement, but also to sort of advance the reform program. We do know, though, that from a conversation with a number of sort of councils, that the capability question is a really, really big one. And we certainly know that from our earlier conversations, and especially out in, and Bill can talk about this with Taumata Arowai, that the whole capability question is, is top of mind for a lot of people. So we do know that from a lot of the councils and the contractors that we have talked to, that they are looking at introducing and bringing on, be it apprenticeships, be it training programs, be it local contractors, etc., just to help try and keep building the capability across the water sector in general, because it is recognised that that is a longer term issue.
It is a long-term issue, and it's not an area where Māori are participating to a high degree throughout the whole country, and I've tried to be diligent about figuring out who Māori are participating in the waters infrastructure space. I could only find two, one in the Hawke's Bay and one up north, who to any degree have had contracts with council with a level of experience and certainty around being able to deliver. But there are other areas where in a procurement space Māori could contribute, but a very small pool at this stage. Can I say though, I am encouraged in the area of stormwater and green infrastructure engineering and design. Māori seem to be going more into that space, and it's that emerging new space of infrastructure where we're looking for more sustainable solutions that Māori appear to be participating and presenting. But Richard's absolutely right. We need to develop not only the talent pipeline, the professional pipeline, but actually those who have who actually are in the business of infrastructure. Then the last thing I would say, if we're looking to a future-proofed, resilient network, then more and more it's in the resilience of green infrastructure solutions that may well be where Māori start to profile themselves to be ahead of the ball.
Thank you both for those comments. I'm just looking at the time we have available. We're getting close to the end of our time. I wonder, rather than answering those last two questions, if we just take a note of those and make sure they're picked up in the hui round, just so that I can invite the other panel members to make any final comments before we wrap this hui up. So we might go this way. We'll go Richard, we'll go Bill, and then Minister will give you the last word, and then we'll close off. Any final comments?
Final comments? Kia ora, Glenn, and I'd just like to thank people for participating today. I think the questions, and there are some tough questions, in fact those last couple of questions there are also really interesting questions, and we have a lot of work to do, and this is really the kick-off of the next stage of the reform program for water services delivery. And attending the hui will give you an opportunity to be able to dig into some of these details, and it'll be critically important for us as we develop these details over the next year that we make sure that we listen to your voices and that we hear what you are saying, and looking for those opportunities to do so. But yes, there are lots of details to be worked through, and really looking forward on behalf of Alan and the rest of the team coming out with Glenn and Tudor to kick off this next stage of engagement. And look forward to it.
Thank you, Richard. Bill?
Why is why. The support and I guess the drive coming from iwi Māori as we started to establish Taumata Arowai has been nothing short of excellent, and I hope we continue to perform and deserve that to continue. I look forward to the hui, and while I can't drive procurement, when you look at our design in terms of regional teams, one of my responsibilities under the Taumata Arowai Entity Act is to grow sector capability. So I look forward to exploring with iwi Māori how some of those regional teams can be very solidly mana whenua representatives who are pursuing iwi Māori interests in water in their own rohi and takiwa.
Thank you, Bill. Minister, just checking if you're still with us and if there's a final comment you wish to make.
Excuse me.
You're still on mute, Minister.
I'd like to thank everyone for participating and also acknowledge Bill and Richard for your contribution. This is a big work program that sits across a number of areas. So by participating in the upcoming forums that we've got, we're able to obviously provide more details, be able to respond to your questions locally and on the ground. This won't be the forum, though, to litigate treaty rights and interests or treaty claims or things like that. So I say that with all respect to everyone who wants to engage with this program. I'll also say that what we have tried to do, certainly in the legislation that is currently being passed for Taumata Arowai and the Water Services Bill, is be absolutely congruent with what iwi have represented in terms of their freshwater aspiration in relation to this work by recognising te mana o te wai. And that thinking has been brought across from the years of thinking that has emerged from various iwi Māori fora. Okay, but ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, kia ora. And I've written some written responses in relation to some of the questions as well, Glenn.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Ko pau te taima, ko pau te wā, anō reire ko tēnei anō taku mihi kia koutou, ko piripiri mai, kei rongi tēnei hui a Ipurangi. We look forward to the opportunity to see some of you on the road, and he mihi anō kia koutou mō ngā pātai, mō ngā whakaaro, mō tēnei hui. Mō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka kite a koutou.
Ka kite.